The air in Vespertine was older than the city outside its leaded glass windows. It was a preserved atmosphere, heavy with the scent of beeswax polished into dark wood, the ghost of a century's worth of simmering sauces, and the faint, clean smell of starched linen. The light was buttery and low, clinging to the deep red of the velvet booths and catching in the facets of the heavy water glasses. It was a place designed for silence, for conversations that happened in the spaces between words. Each sound was distinct: the soft clink of silverware on porcelain, the sigh of a wine cork leaving a bottle, the funereal tread of the waiters on the thick Persian rugs. It was a sanctuary of tradition in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. Alara moved through this space like a phantom. She was not a waitress. She was a function, a pair of hands, an extension of the restaurant's will. Her uniform, a simple black dress, a crisp white apron tied just so, was a costume of invisibility. Her movements were a study in economy. No wasted steps, no superfluous gestures. When she placed a glass on a table, it landed without a sound. When she refilled water, the stream was a silent, perfect arc. She had been here for 2 years, and in that time, she had perfected the art of self-erasure. Her past was a collapsed building, a ruin she had walked away from, and this quiet, repetitive work was the fence she had built around it. Her features were pleasant but forgettable, her expression a placid mask of professional neutrality. Customers saw the apron, the water pitcher, the pen and pad, but they did not see her. It was how she wanted it. Her father had been an architect. Not a designer of glass boxes that scraped the sky, but a builder of foundations. He spoke of load-bearing walls and structural integrity as if they were moral concepts. A building, he would say, is an argument. It argues for permanence, for shelter, for a place in the world. Its honesty is in its structure, a weak foundation, a compromised beam. These were not engineering flaws. They were lies. And lies, he taught her, always bring the building down. He had been a man of principle, and the world had crushed him for it. A corrupt developer, a fraudulent contract, a legacy reduced to lawsuits and dust. Alara had learned the lesson well. The world was built on lies. The only safety was in having no structure to collapse, in becoming invisible. At 8 o'clock, the stillness in the room deepened. It was not a drop in sound, but a change in pressure, as if the air itself had gained weight. Alistair Rousseau had arrived. He did not make an entrance. He simply was. One moment the host stand was empty. The next he was there, a tall, still figure in a suit so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. His face was all sharp angles and quiet intelligence, his eyes the color of old iron. He was not a man who moved. He was a man who occupied space, and the space he occupied became his. The host, a young man named Julian, simply inclined his head. Booth 4. Always. Alara felt the shift, as she always did. It was a subtle vibration in the floor, a tightening in the chests of the other staff. Rousseau was not a customer. He was the restaurant's silent patron, its anchor. Mr. Giancarlo, the elderly owner, had known Rousseau's father. The restaurant was a living monument to that old-world loyalty. Rousseau moved toward his booth in the far corner, a space shrouded in shadow. His 2 guards, men who looked as if they were carved from the same granite as their employer, did not follow him to the table. They peeled off, one stationing himself near the kitchen door, the other melting into the shadows by the entrance. They were not guards. They were architectural supports, reinforcing the perimeter. Rousseau sat down. The leather of the booth did not sigh under his weight. He placed his hands on the table and became perfectly still, a predator at rest. He did not need a menu. He did not need to speak. He was waiting for a ritual to unfold. Alara picked up a chilled bottle of San Pellegrino and 2 glasses, the crystal thin and resonant. It was her turn in the ritual. As she started her silent, practiced journey across the dining room, the heavy oak door swung open again, letting in a blast of city noise, and a man who was the antithesis of everything Vespertine stood for. The new arrival was not a presence. He was a disruption. Marco Bellini entered the restaurant like a thrown rock, shattering the quiet surface of the room. He was shorter than Russo, but wider, packed into a suit of electric blue that seemed to shout its price tag. A thick gold chain rested on his chest, a gaudy anchor. His hair was slicked back with too much product, gleaming wetly under the soft lights. He moved with a swaggering, predatory drift, his eyes scanning the room not with appreciation, but with appraisal, as if valuing every object for a potential pawn. Two men flanked him, their shoulders bunching the fabric of their cheaper suits. They were cruder versions of Russo's silent sentinels, less granite, more gravel. They looked uncomfortable in the refined space, their bodies coiled with a street corner tension. The curated atmosphere of Vespertine curdled. Diners who had been lost in their meals looked up, their forks pausing mid-air. A low, anxious murmur rippled through the room. It was the sound of an ecosystem detecting an invasive species. Mr. Giancarlo, who had been overseeing the polishing of wine glasses at the bar, straightened up. A flicker of something old and weary crossed his face. His shoulders, usually stooped with the gentle weight of his 80 years, seemed to fall a little further. He made a small, almost imperceptible motion to Julian, the host, a gesture that said, "Handle this." Julian, pale and barely out of his teens, approached the trio. His professional smile was a thin, brittle thing. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to Vespertine. Do you have a reservation?" Bellini laughed, a loud, grating sound that scraped against the room's tranquility. "Reservation?" He looked at his two thugs. "You hear that, boys? He wants to know if we got a reservation." He turned back to Julian, his smile a carnivorous slash. "The whole city is my reservation, kid. I want the best table you got. Somewhere I can see everything." Julian's eyes darted around the room. It was a full house, a sea of quiet, wealthy patrons who paid for this specific brand of peace. His gaze flickered toward Mr. Giancarlo, a silent plea for help, but the old man was trapped behind the bar, cornered by the sudden shift in social tectonics. Julian's eyes landed on Alara, who was gliding past on her way to an adjacent table, her focus absolute. Then his panicked gaze swept the room one last time and snagged on the one open space, the one booth that was always, inviolably, both taken and empty. Booth 4. Russo was a shadow within it, a detail one might overlook if one did not know to look for him. In his panic, Julian's brain performed a fatal calculation. The booth was large. Russo was one man. He made a decision born of fear, not logic. He turned back to Bellini, his voice thin. "Of course, sir. Right this way." He gestured vaguely in the direction of booth 4. Alara, having just set down bread and olive oil at table 7, turned at the subtle clearing of Julian's throat. He caught her eye and gave a sharp, desperate nod toward the new arrivals, then toward the corner booth. The instruction was clear. Seat them. She did not know the faces. She did not understand the politics that were like invisible tripwires all over the restaurant floor. She knew only the protocol. A customer needed to be seated. Her job was to facilitate that process with quiet efficiency. She gave a single, brief nod of acknowledgement. She turned to face the disruption. "Sir," she said, her voice a calm, neutral instrument. "Your table is this way. Please, follow me." She did not know she was leading a lit fuse toward a powder keg. The walk was 100 feet of stretched time. Each step Alara took was measured, her back straight, her focus narrowed to the task of leading a patron to his seat. But behind her, the steps were different. Her own soft-soled shoes made no sound on the ancient wood floors. Theirs were a violation. The hard leather heels of Bellini's garish loafers clicked and echoed, an arrogant staccato against the room's hushed rhythm. His men followed with a heavier, shuffling tread, the sound of men unused to walking on anything but concrete. It was a desecration. Alara could feel the eyes of every diner on her back. They were not looking at Bellini. They were looking at her, the guide, the one leading this sacrilege into the heart of their temple. She kept her gaze fixed on the destination, the dark, waiting mouth of Booth 4. In her mind, the restaurant was a blueprint, a grid of tables, stations, and pathways. Her route was the most efficient line between 2 points. She was not processing the social data, the waves of fear and disapproval coming from the surrounding tables. She was executing a function. Her father had taught her to focus on the task, to understand the structure of the work. The work, right now, was to walk from point A to point B. The emotional fallout was not part of the equation. It was noise. As they drew closer, the shadow in the booth resolved itself. A man, sitting alone, his form defined by the impeccable lines of a dark suit. He was looking down at a menu, though the angle of his head suggested he wasn't reading it. He was simply holding it, an object to occupy his hands. Alara registered his presence as a simple fact. The table was occupied. Julian had made a mistake, a common occurrence on a busy night. Her mind was already formulating the solution. A polite apology, a redirection to the bar where they could wait, a complimentary drink to smooth over the error. Professional, clean, no fuss. They arrived. The space around the booth was thick with a palpable stillness, a zone of immense gravitational pull. Bellini and his men came to a halt behind her, their aggressive energy crashing against this invisible wall of calm. Alara stopped a respectful 2 feet from the table. She prepared to speak to the seated man, to begin the quiet work of diplomacy. But Bellini, impatient and imperious, pushed past her. He leaned over the table, his garish suit a slash of color in the dimness, his voice a loud, mocking drawl. "Hey, pal. Looks like you're in my seat." The man in the booth did not look up. He slowly, deliberately folded his menu and placed it on the table. Then he raised his head. In the low light, Alistair Rousseau's eyes seemed to hold all the cold, dark weight of the room. He looked at Bellini, and a silence descended that was deeper and more terrifying than any that had come before. But Alara did not yet understand. She still saw only a logistical error to be corrected. She stepped forward, placing herself slightly between the 2 men, a fragile barrier of professional courtesy. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said, her voice directed at Bellini but intended for both. "There seems to have been a mistake. This table is occupied. If you'll allow me, I can find you a comfortable spot at the bar while we arrange another table for you." Her words were perfectly calibrated, designed to de-escalate, to soothe, to manage. They were utterly ignored. Bellini's eyes were locked on Rousseau. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. It was a smile of dawning realization, of delighted opportunity. "Rousseau. What a coincidence." He straightened up, puffing out his chest. He wasn't just taking a table. He was making a statement. He gestured dismissively at the booth. "Get up. I got business to discuss. The old ways are over. Time for new management." The words were a declaration of war, spoken in the language of corporate takeover, but with the clear implication of violence. Rousseau did not move. He did not speak. His stillness was absolute, his gaze unwavering. He was a mountain, and Bellini was a caustic wind blowing against it. The power in the confrontation was entirely one-sided, but not in the way Bellini imagined. Rousseau's silence was a verdict. It judged Bellini and found him wanting. Alara tried again, her training overriding the prickle of fear that was beginning to penetrate her professional armor. "Sir, please, we can handle this. There's no need for any trouble." This time, Bellini acknowledged her. He turned, his face a mask of contempt, and looked down at her as if she were an insect. He made a shooing motion with his hand. "Get out of here, sweetheart. The adults are talking." When she didn't move, his expression hardened. He didn't just motion. He shoved her. It wasn't a violent push, not meant to injure. It was a push of dismissal, a casual, contemptuous act of asserting dominance over a piece of furniture that happened to be alive. He put his hand on her shoulder and pushed her backward, clearing his line of sight to Russo. The shove was nothing. A few inches of displacement. A slight stumble she easily corrected. But it was not the force that mattered. It was the contact. It was the violation of her space, the casual assertion that she was an object to be moved. In that instant, the carefully constructed walls of her anonymity cracked. The shove was a physical input that triggered a catastrophic failure in the system of her self-control. A memory, not a thought, detonated behind her eyes. It was not a scene, but a cascade of sensory data. The screech of tortured steel. The deep, guttural groan of a foundation giving way. The taste of concrete dust and plaster in the air, a dry, choking cloud. The sight of her father's face, not angry, not sad, but utterly, devastatingly defeated as he watched his life's work, a beautiful library built on integrity, crumble into a pile of fraudulent rubble. He hadn't been shoved. He had been erased, pushed aside by men like this. Men who saw the world not as something to be built, but as something to be taken, to be broken for parts. A lie always brings the building down. His voice echoed in her memory. Alara straightened up from her slight stumble. The movement was small, almost imperceptible. But everything had changed. The apologetic, accommodating posture of the waitress was gone. Her shoulders settled, her spine aligning into a column of perfect, rigid support. The placid mask on her face dissolved, replaced by a stillness that mirrored the man in the booth. Her hands, which had been held loosely in front of her, fell to her sides, the fingers slightly curled. She was no longer a function of the restaurant. She was a structure, and her foundation was being tested. She lifted her head, and for the first time she looked, truly looked, at the men before her. She was no longer seeing a rude customer and his associates. She was seeing a faulty design. She saw the overconfidence in Bellini as a stress fracture. She saw the brutish, undisciplined tension in his men as a critical load imbalance. She saw the whole situation not as a social conflict, but as a structural problem in need of correction. Alistair Russo saw it. He, who had been focused entirely on the challenge posed by Bellini, felt his attention shift. It was a flicker at the edge of his vision, a change in the geometry of the scene. The waitress, the negligible variable, had just become a factor. He had seen her before, dozens of times, a ghost in a white apron. He had never registered her face. Now he did. He saw the sudden, shocking alignment of her body. He saw the shift in her eyes, the way the ambient light of the room now seemed to gather there, cold and focused. He saw a woman who had been pretending to be a waitress, and the pretense had just ended. He didn't know what she was, but he recognized the quality of the change. It was the same quality he saw in his own men just before violence was required. It was the quality of absolute, unshakable resolve. He leaned back, a fractional movement, and for the first time that night, he became an observer. Bellini, however, was blind to the subtle shift. His focus was narrow, fixed on the prize, Russo's submission. He saw Alara's stillness not as a threat, but as fear-induced paralysis. "Good girl," he sneered, turning his attention away from her. He felt he had dealt with the insect. Now, back to the lion. He decided a change of tactics was in order. A direct confrontation with Russo was a stalemate. He needed a different lever. His eyes scanned the room and found one. Mr. Giancarlo was slowly making his way from behind the bar, his ancient legs unsteady. His face was a mess of worry and fear. He was coming to plead, to appeal to a sense of decency Bellini did not possess. Bellini's cruel smile widened. Perfect. He met the old man halfway, intercepting him before he could reach the booth. "Giancarlo, my friend," he said, draping a heavy arm over the old man's frail shoulders. The gesture was a mockery of affection. It was a python coiling. "We need to talk about your protection payments. They're late, and I'm starting to think this place isn't worth protecting anymore. Maybe it's time for a change of ownership. A hostile takeover." Mr. Giancarlo flinched, the color drained from his face. "Please, Marco. Not here. This is a respectable place." "Respectable?" Bellini's voice rose, carrying through the silent room. "Respectable doesn't pay the bills. Respectable gets old. It gets weak. It gets replaced." He gave the old man's shoulder a squeeze, a gesture of casual cruelty that made Mr. Giancarlo wince in pain. "Maybe I'll turn it into a sports bar. Lots of TVs, loud music. What do you think?" It was the final stress on the system. The threat was no longer abstract. It was specific, personal, and directed at the most vulnerable person in the room. It was directed at the Foundation. Alara moved. It was only 2 steps, quick and silent. She did not rush. She simply repositioned herself. One moment she was by the booth. The next she was standing directly between Marco Bellini and Mr. Giancarlo. She did not touch either of them. She simply occupied the space. An interruption. A wall. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the waitress's voice. It was not neutral or accommodating. It was low, steady, and held a resonance that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "That's enough." The words were not a plea. They were not a request. They were a command. A structural engineer pointing to a fatal flaw and stating simply, "This must be corrected." The entire narrative of the room, which had been centered on the silent power of Russo and the loud aggression of Bellini, suddenly pivoted and came to rest on the quiet, immovable figure of the waitress. For a moment, Bellini was too stunned to react. He stared at her, this nothing, this servant who had dared to give him an order. The sheer audacity of it short-circuited his brain. Then a wave of rage washed over his surprise. He peeled his arm off Mr. Giancarlo and took a half-step toward her, his face contorting. "What did you just say to me?" One of his thugs, the one on his right, decided to be proactive. He saw his boss being challenged, and his simple, violent calculus dictated a simple, violent response. He moved to grab her, to haul her out of the way. His hand, thick and calloused, reached for her arm. He never touched her. Alara's movement was a whisper of violence. It was not a fight. It was a correction. As his hand came toward her, she didn't step back. She pivoted on the ball of her left foot, a small, precise rotation of her hips. Her body flowed around his grasping arm. Her left hand came up, not to block, but to guide. It cupped his elbow gently. Her right hand, open-palmed, met the inside of his wrist. It looked like a dance step. It was physics. It was architecture. She did not push or pull. She redirected. All the forward momentum of his lunge, all the kinetic energy of his 200-pound frame, was suddenly funneled into a single, unnatural vector. His arm, guided by her hands, was twisted past its point of structural tolerance. There was a sickeningly wet pop, the sound of a ligament tearing away from bone. The man's face, which had been a mask of brutish confidence, dissolved into a canvas of pure, bewildered agony. A strangled cry escaped his lips as his own weight, now unopposed, carried him forward and down. His legs tangled. He fell, not with a crash, but with a heavy, boneless slump, landing in a heap at the feet of the diners at the next table. He lay there, clutching his now useless arm, his breath coming in ragged, shocked gasps. The entire sequence had taken less than 2 seconds. The room, which had been silent, became something else. It entered a state of absolute vacuum. Sound itself seemed to have died. The second thug, who had been a half-step behind his companion, froze mid-stride. His brain tried to process what his eyes had just seen, and failed. He looked from his writhing partner on the floor to the still figure of the waitress, and his face went slack with a primal, instinctual fear. He had seen violence his whole life. Bar fights, beatings, stabbings. He had never seen anything like this. This was not anger. It was efficiency. It was like watching a machine perform a task for which it was perfectly designed. Alara had not moved from her spot. Her feet were still planted, a solid, balanced stance. Her hands had returned to her sides. Her breathing was even, her expression unchanged. It was the chilling calm of the performance that was so terrifying. She had dismantled a man twice her size, as if she were folding a napkin. She lifted her eyes from the collapsed thug and fixed them on Marco Bellini. The silence that followed was a physical presence. It was heavier than the velvet drapes, colder than the marble bar top. It was the silence of a tomb. The only sound was the ragged, wet choking of the man on the floor, a sound that amplified the stillness around it. Every diner was frozen, statues of shock. The busboy, a teenager named Leo, stood paralyzed by the kitchen door, a tray of dirty dishes held in his trembling hands. He had seen the waitress, Alara, every day for a year. He thought she was nice, quiet, maybe a little sad. He was now looking at a person he did not know at all. Alara's gaze was locked on Marco Bellini. It was not a glare. It was an assessment. Her eyes, which had been professionally vacant just moments before, were now filled with a terrifying clarity. She looked at him the way her father had taught her to look at a blueprint, searching for the load-bearing points, the weak joints, the lines of stress. She saw the blustering rage in his face for what it was, a cosmetic facade over a foundation of cowardice. She saw the flicker of fear in his eyes as he glanced at his fallen man. She saw the whole shoddy structure of his persona, and she knew exactly where to apply pressure. She spoke. Her voice was no louder than before, but it cut through the silence like a diamond blade through glass. You are leaving. It was not a threat. It was a statement of irrefutable fact. It was an architect condemning a compromised structure. Bellini stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. The fury in his face was rapidly being replaced by a confusion that was curdling into fear. This was not in his playbook. He knew how to handle men like Russo, with posturing, with threats, with leverage. He knew how to handle underlings, with contempt and casual violence. He did not know what to do with this. This woman was not a category of person he had ever encountered. She was a glitch in his reality. His remaining thug, the one still standing, looked from Alara to his boss, his eyes wide with a silent question. What do we do? He was a hammer, and this was not a nail. All his instincts screamed at him to retreat. Bellini's mind raced. His authority, his very identity, was built on a performance of dominance. To back down now in front of a room full of witnesses, in front of Russo, was unthinkable. It would be the end of him. He had to reassert control. He opened his mouth, trying to summon the rage, the sneer, the words that had always worked for him. He began to say, "You think you can—" He was cut off, not by a word, but by a sound. A soft, dry scrape of wood on wood. Alistair Russo had moved. He hadn't stood. He had simply picked up his water glass from the table and placed it back down, a quarter of an inch to the left. The sound was tiny, insignificant. But in the cathedral of silence, it was a thunderclap. Every eye in the room, including Bellini's, snapped to him. Russo's face was unreadable. He was looking at Alara, his head tilted in an expression of intense, analytical curiosity. He had witnessed the entire event without a flicker of expression. He had watched her move, had seen the brutal economy of her action, and had processed it. Now he made his own move. He lifted his right hand, a small, almost lazy gesture. He did not snap his fingers. He did not signal. He simply raised his hand. From the periphery, from the deep shadows of the restaurant that no one ever paid attention to, figures detached themselves. The man by the kitchen door, the one by the entrance, another from an alcove near the restrooms, a fourth who had been sitting at the bar, nursing a single espresso for an hour. They were Russo's men. They had been there all along, woven into the fabric of the room, invisible until summoned. They moved without a sound, converging on Bellini and his last standing man with a coordinated, fluid grace. They did not draw weapons. They did not need to. Their presence was weapon enough. They formed a loose, inescapable circle. It was not a threat of immediate violence. It was a statement of absolute control. The architecture of the room had been reconfigured. Bellini and his man were no longer predators. They were trapped. Russo finally spoke. His voice was quiet, conversational, yet it carried with perfect clarity to every corner of the room. He did not address Bellini. He did not address his men. He spoke to Alara. "Are you all right, miss?" The question was a fulcrum upon which the entire power dynamic of the city's underworld shifted. With those 5 words, Russo did something far more devastating to Bellini than any physical threat. He abdicated his own authority in the situation and handed it to her. He acknowledged that the incident was hers to command, that its resolution was in her hands. He was asking for her assessment, her permission to proceed. He was not saving her. He was reinforcing her. Bellini understood. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly gray. The humiliation was total. He had come to challenge a king and had been defeated by a waitress, and the king had just publicly validated her victory. He had been rendered irrelevant in his own failed coup. Russo's man, the one who had been by the door, took a step toward Bellini. He didn't speak. He just looked at him. Bellini stumbled backward, his bravado utterly shattered. He looked at his man on the floor, at the circle of silent, implacable figures, at the terrifyingly calm waitress, and finally, at Russo, whose cold eyes offered no mercy. He turned and practically fled, his remaining thugs scrambling after him, dragging their groaning companion with them. Their retreat was not a walk. It was a rout. The sound of their footsteps was no longer arrogant and loud, but hurried and pathetic, the sound of rats scurrying from the light. The heavy oak door swung shut behind them, and the silence they left in their wake was clean. The atmosphere in Vespertine began a slow, hesitant return to something resembling normalcy. It was like the air after a lightning strike, still charged, smelling of ozone. The memory of the flash burned into every retina. Diners slowly turned back to their plates, but no one was eating. They murmured in low, shocked tones, their eyes darting toward the corner booth, toward the woman in the white apron who stood unmoving. Leo, the young busboy, finally found the strength to move. His hands trembled so badly that the glasses on his tray rattled a soft, jittery tune. He approached the spot where Bellini's man had fallen. A water glass had been overturned in the chaos, and a small pool of water was spreading across the polished floor. With shaking hands, Leo knelt, pulling a cloth from his apron and beginning to meticulously wipe away the spill. He kept his eyes down, focused on the small, manageable task, as if by erasing the physical evidence, he could erase the memory of what he had just witnessed. Mr. Giancarlo, who had been frozen in place, let out a long, shuddering breath. He looked at Alara, his eyes filled with a mixture of terror and awe. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He simply reached out a trembling hand and placed it on her arm for a moment. A silent, grateful acknowledgement. Alara stood still, the adrenaline beginning to recede from her system, leaving a cold, hollow feeling in its wake. The structural correction was complete. The threat was neutralized. But the cost was high. Her invisibility was shattered. The ruin she had hidden from was now exposed to the light. Alistair Russo rose from his booth. The movement was fluid, silent. He walked not to the exit, but toward her. He stopped a few feet away, his presence a zone of quiet gravity. His men remained at their posts, a silent, watchful perimeter. Russo did not thank her. He did not comment on the violence. He simply observed her, his iron-dark eyes holding an expression of deep, clinical assessment. He was looking at her the way he might look at a new acquisition, a rare and complex piece of art whose true value was only just being revealed. He spoke, his voice low, and for her alone. "Your father was Michael Vance." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. The name landed like a stone, sending ripples through the quiet pool of her carefully constructed anonymity. Michael Vance, the architect, the man of principle, the man who had once designed a summer home for Russo's own father, a structure of such perfect, honest design that Russo still considered it a masterpiece, a man who had later been destroyed by a consortium of greedy developers, one of whom had been a younger, more reckless Marco Bellini. He believed a structure's integrity was its soul, Russo continued, his gaze never leaving her face. He would not compromise. They broke him for it. He paused, letting the weight of the history settle between them. "You have his foundation." The words struck Alara with more force than Bellini's shove. "You have his foundation." It was not a compliment. It was a diagnosis. He saw it. He saw the principles she had tried to bury, the legacy she had tried to escape. He saw her father in her, not in her face, but in the uncompromising line of her spine, in the brutal honesty of her actions. For 2 years, she had worked to erase every trace of Michael Vance's daughter. In 2 minutes, she had become his living embodiment. She didn't know what to say. The carefully managed systems of her life had all failed at once. The silence stretched. Russo seemed to be waiting for a response, but Alara had none to give. She felt exposed, stripped down to the very framework of her being. The waitress uniform felt like a cheap costume, the restaurant a stage she no longer had a part on. She had broken the cardinal rule of her survival. She had been seen. Russo broke the silence. "This life," he said with a subtle gesture that encompassed the restaurant, the city, his entire world, is a structure, an old one, built on codes and loyalties that the new world finds inconvenient. Men like Bellini, they are not builders. They are termites. They chew at the foundations, thinking only of their immediate hunger. They don't see that they are bringing the entire building down on their own heads. He took a half-step closer. His voice dropped even lower, becoming a conspiratorial murmur. "I spend my days shoring up walls, reinforcing beams, but I am a preservationist, not an architect. I can only maintain what was built. I cannot see the flaws in the design until the cracks are already showing." He looked at her, and his eyes were not cold now. They were filled with a startling intensity, a spark of intellectual fire. "You can. You see the stress points before they fail. You understand the geometry of power. What you did tonight, it wasn't a brawl. It was a structural correction. Precise. Final. You didn't just remove a threat. You exposed a fatal design flaw in Bellini's entire operation." He paused. "I have a place for a person with such a talent. Not as a bodyguard. I have men who can break things. I need someone who understands how things are built, how they stand, and how they fall." It was an offer. Not of a job, but of a purpose. He wasn't offering her a weapon to wield. He was offering her a blueprint and a set of tools. He was offering her a chance to stop being a ghost haunting a ruin and to become a builder. To take her father's broken legacy and use it to construct something new, something strong enough to withstand the termites of the world. Alara found her voice. It was rusty, unused to carrying the weight of her own will. "I'm not like you," she said, the words stark. Russo gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. I know. That is why I need you. My father built this organization on a foundation of honor. I have tried to maintain it. But the world changes. The materials are weaker. The plans are corrupt. I need an architect, Miss Vance. Someone with an honest eye. Someone who remembers what a true foundation looks like. She looked past him, at the restaurant slowly healing itself, at Leo, now silently sweeping the floor, at Mr. Giancarlo, directing the staff with quiet, reassuring gestures. This place was a structure her father would have admired. It had integrity. It was worth protecting. She thought of the library, of the dust, of the defeat in her father's eyes. Hiding had not honored him. Becoming invisible had not preserved his principles. She met Russo's gaze. Her own was now as clear and steady as his. I don't work for anyone, she said. It was a statement of her own integrity, a declaration of her own terms. Russo's lips curved in the barest hint of a smile. It was not a smile of amusement, but of recognition, of respect. I am not looking for an employee, he replied. I am looking for a partner. He extended a hand, not for a handshake, but as an open gesture. The blueprints are in my office. We have a great deal to build. She looked at his hand, then back at his face. She did not take it. Instead, she gave a single, sharp nod. The same nod she had given Julian when he'd told her to seat the man who had almost destroyed her. But this time, it meant something entirely different. It was not an acknowledgement of an order. It was an acceptance of a contract. On her own terms. A new structure was about to be built. Months later, the view from the penthouse office was a tapestry of city lights. The geometry of the metropolis spread out below, a grid of power, ambition, and decay. The office itself was the opposite of Vespertine's warm, aged comfort. It was a space of clean lines, dark chrome, and cool leather. It was a command center, a place of silent, strategic observation. Alara stood before a vast, wall-mounted screen. She was no longer wearing the black dress and white apron. She wore a simple, impeccably tailored charcoal suit, the kind of clothing that was not a costume, but a statement of quiet, functional authority. The screen did not show stock tickers or security feeds. It displayed a complex, branching diagram, a network of names, businesses, and lines of influence. It was the blueprint of Alistair Russo's organization. Russo stood beside her, a glass of something dark in his hand. He was looking at the diagram, but his attention was on her. He had watched her work for weeks. She had moved through his world with the same quiet, analytical precision she had displayed in the restaurant. She spoke little, but her observations were devastatingly accurate. She pointed out loyalties that were fraying like stressed cables, financial arrangements that were unbalanced, lieutenants whose ambitions were creating dangerous structural loads. She was not a gangster. She was not a killer. She was an architect of power. Bellini's entire operation has collapsed, Russo said, his voice a low rumble. When you broke his man, you broke the illusion of his strength. The rest of his people saw the flaw in his design. They abandoned him. Alara pointed to a name on the screen, a mid-level functionary in the city's zoning department. This is the next point of failure. He's taking bribes from a new development group out of Chicago. They are using substandard materials. They will build 12 towers with foundations of sand. Her voice was calm, factual. It's the same pattern, the same lie. Russo looked at the name, then back at her. What do you propose? We don't threaten him, she said. We don't buy him. We expose the truth. We give the building inspectors the real structural analysis. We give the press the financial records. You don't fight a lie with violence. You fight it with a more powerful truth. It was her father's philosophy, reforged into a weapon. Russo was silent for a long moment, studying her profile in the glow of the screen. He saw the same uncompromising integrity that had been his own father's code. the same intelligence that had been Michael Vance's gift. But in her, these qualities were not brittle. They were tempered, hardened by loss, and focused into something formidable. He had sought a partner to preserve his father's legacy. He had found something more, a woman who would build a new one. He nodded slowly. Make the arrangements. Alara turned from the screen and looked out at the sprawling city. From this height, the chaos and noise were rendered into a silent, beautiful pattern. She had spent years trying to erase herself, to become a ghost. But she had learned a new truth. One cannot protect a structure by abandoning it. One cannot honor a foundation by hiding in the ruins. Some structures are built not of steel and glass, but of principle, and they are the only ones that last.